Okay, I'm going to wait a couple of seconds for everyone to join us. All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know that folks are joining us from several different time zones today. So welcome to you all. Welcome to this live stream conversation with Professor Hamid Dabbashy on the occasion of the launch of his new book, The Last Muslim Intellectual, The Life and Legacy of Jalal Al-Ahmad. My name is Siyavesh Safari. I am an associate professor of West Asian Studies in the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations at Seoul National University. And it's my distinct pleasure and honor to host this conversation today with my dear teacher and mentor, Professor Dabbashy. Before we get started with the conversation, a quick housekeeping note on the format of today's event. As you've noticed by now, this is a Zoom webinar format. We have audience members joining us from various parts of the world. And even though we don't have your audio and video, I do encourage you to share your thoughts, comments, and questions with us through the Zoom Q&A box, which you will see at the bottom of your Zoom platform. And I'll make sure that I'll address your thoughts and questions to Professor Dabbashy. In just a few seconds, I will introduce Professor Dabbashy, then I will pass the floor to him to make some introductory remarks about the book. After that, I'll make some brief comments followed by a Q&A. I have prepared some questions of my own. I have also received questions via email, which I will share with Professor Dabbashy during the Q&A. And as I mentioned before, I do encourage you to share your comments and questions through the Q&A box. This event will be approximately 75 minutes, so I will try to wrap it up by 10:15 a.m. Korean Standard Time or 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, let me briefly say something by way of an introduction. Even though most of you are already familiar with Professor Dabbashy and his illustrious body of scholarship, Hamid Dabbashy is the Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He received a dual PhD in Sociology of Culture and Islamic Studies from the University of Pennsylvania in 1984, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard University. He has published over 100 essays, articles, book chapters, and book reviews on a range of subjects, including Iranian studies, medieval and modern Islam, comparative literature, world cinema, and the philosophy of art. He has also authored and edited more than 30 books, including, and I'll just mention a few of them here, Authority in Islam in 1989, Theology of Discontent in 1993, Truth and Narrative in 1999, Close Up, Iranian Cinema, Past, Present, Future in 2001, Dreams of a Nation on Palestinian Cinema in 2006, Shi'ism, a Religion of Revolt, a Religion of Protest, 2011, The World of Persian Literary Humanism in 2012, Can Non-Europeans Think in 2015, The Shahnameh, the Persian Epic as World Literature in 2019, and Reversing the Colonial Gaze, Persian Travelers Abroad in 2020. The new book, which we're discussing today, is The Last Muslim Intellectual, The Life and Legacy of Jalal Al-Ahmad. which was published earlier this year as part of the Edinburgh University Press's series on historical studies of Iran and the Persian world. The book is currently available as hardcover and ebook. Hopefully, I'm sure there will be a paperback edition soon. And just like Professor Dabwashi's previous books, this one too is both a compelling and fascinating work of scholarship and also a charming and engaging read. I do have more to say about the book, but for now, I will pass the floor or the mic to Professor Hamid Dabwashi, and then I'll come back with my comments and questions after his remarks. Professor Dabwashi, befirmayid.
Can you hear me, Siavash?
Yes.
First and foremost, Siavash, thank you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I know you're in South Korea. You're halfway around the globe from me. As you know, I'm talking from Columbia campus, where I had the privilege of hosting you soon after your PhD when you had a postdoc. So I have very fond memories of your being on our campus and working on your book. I also want to thank Mujtaba for very graciously being the person who initiated this event, but could not join us. We miss him. I dearly love Mujtaba. He's a precious member of our community. And some of my fondest memory of being in Canada is with you and Mujtaba. And I wish, again, there would be opportunity for us to be together. And I also want to thank all the friends who have joined us from around the world. I don't see them with my eyes, but I see them in my mind's eyes. And I'm grateful that they're here to be part of the conversation. Now, what to say, whatever I want to say about the book is in the book. Al-Ahmad needs no introduction. He has been a seminal figure in my youth. And as I have said recently, this series of books that now are coming are very autobiographical. I recently published a book on Edward Said, which is a collection of my essays on Edward Said. And in a way, Edward Said was Al-Ahmad of my adulthood, and Al-Ahmad was Edward Said of my youth. Whether we agree with him or don't agree with him, Al-Ahmad is a seminal figure, as you well know, is a figure that people don't have any sort of neutral opinion. Many adore him, many are very critical of him. And he, despite the fact that, as you know, he lived a very short life, he died from a sudden heart failure, as his wife, the late Simin Daneshvar, has told us. So my turning to him again had a strong element of autobiographical recollection. I basically missed reading him, especially his essays. But also, as you know, the book pivots towards the last chapter, which is a theology of post-Islamism. I borrow the concept of post-Islamism from my distinguished colleague, Asif Bayat, that again, I just remember last time Asif and I saw each other was in Doha, but just before that, we were in Canada, but west coast of Canada. At any rate, this idea of post-Islamism is something that he came up with. Is a brilliant idea of Asif, and I take it, I borrow it from Asif, and I go somewhere else with it. And the proposition of the last Muslim intellectual that has intrigued some people has to do with the cosmopolitan worldliness of which Edward Said, Jalal al-Ahmad was a member. And I have tried my best to tease him out from the context in which he belongs, but to wed him into more comparative context in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And in doing so, I would say, in my own judgment, the chapter on his relationship with his wife, Simin Daneshvar, to me is a pivotal chapter. As I started working, 4 volumes of their correspondences were published, and I began reading them, and it is absolutely so fascinating. The majority of the letters are actually from Al Ahmad to Simin Daneshvar. And in the course of that chapter, I came with this idea of the gendered voice, that because they were so close to each other, that became definitive to the rest of the book. So that is the book. I'm going to stop here. I would say 3 aspects of it are crucial to me. One is this latter stage of my writing, which is autobiographical. So I simply wanted to come to terms with what Al Ahmad meant for us, despite the fact that, as you know, I began to write on him since my theology of discontent. But this is a complementary a section that begins with that period of writing, but culminates in some other new directions. Second is this notion of post-Islamism, Asif Bayat's idea, which is very crucial. And third is this gendered voice that emanates from the chapter in his relationship with Simin Khanum Daneshvar. So yeah, I hope people get a chance. Those who are here, I believe they get a discount from Edinburgh University Press. But more importantly, I just filled out the form that the book will be made available in open access soon through Edinburgh University Press. It has been selected as one of their open access books, which I hope will make it available readily around the globe.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dabbashy, for those remarks. I'm going to make some brief comments about the book. And let me start my brief comments by saying that for me personally, and maybe for my students too, this book could not have come out at a better time. This semester, I happen to be teaching a graduate seminar on Orientalism and Occidentalism with a focus on Jalal Al Ahmad. So as soon as I learned about your new book, I immediately had to put it on my syllabus. And for the last few weeks, my students and I have been reading and discussing the book in our graduate seminar. My guess is we're probably the first graduate seminar anywhere in the world to have this book on its syllabus. But reading the book has been a great joy. Like I said before, not only is it a compelling work of scholarship, it's also a gripping read. It's witty, it's emotional, it's sometimes provocative. There are parts of the book in chapter 3 specifically, which you mentioned. It's about the relationship between Jalal and his wife, the great novelist Simin Daneshvar, that while I was reading the book, I had tears coming down the side of my face. And there were other parts of the book that I found myself incessantly taking notes, having a spirited conversation in my own head with Professor Dabbashy, having some disagreements with him about his reading of Ali Shariati, but of course that's a conversation for another time. I recommend the book to all of you, and I recommend you read it cover to cover, as Professor Dabbashy himself reminds us in this book of the lost value of reading books cover to cover. I want to make a couple of observations about the book, and then I'll have some questions for Professor Dabbashy. My first observation is about the book's contribution to our understanding of Jalal Al Ahmad, because this book has come to us in 2021, more than half a century, almost 52 years after Al Ahmad's death. And during the last half a century, we've seen a few generations of works and commentaries on Al Ahmad. As Dabbashy himself explains in the book, these works on Al Ahmad have tended either to lionize or demonize him. There are many people who seem still either to love Ala Ahmad or to hate him for all the wrong reasons. And both of these groups seem to share the same misreading of Ala Ahmad's work. Both groups see Ala Ahmad as this anti-Western, nativist, identitarian intellectual who fears industrial modernity, and he fantasizes about, a return to an authentic Islamic tradition or Islamic past. Against the grain of this misreading, which Professor Dabashi goes through and deconstructs in his book, a new generation of scholars in recent years have engaged in a very different reading of Ala Ahmad. And they have read him in dialogue with other progressive and emancipatory critiques of coloniality and Eurocentrism. And here I'm referring to scholars such as Ajay Singh Chaudhry from Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, who wrote his PhD on Ala Ahmad under Professor Dabashi's supervision. My dear friend Gulnar Nikpur from Dartmouth College, who is also a former student of Professor Dabashi. Shirin Deylami from Western Washington University, Eskandar Sadiqi Bourjerdi from University of London, and others. So it seems to me that half a century after his death, the scholarship on Ala Ahmad is at a turning point. And Professor Dabashi's comprehensive book on the life and legacy of Ala Ahmad really consolidates this turn and brings Ala Ahmad into a full-fledged conversation, not only with post-colonial and decolonial theory, but also with a whole host of emancipatory visions of the world. My second observation is really a tentative observation. It's a raw observation for now about how we might try to situate this book in Professor Dabashi's own body of work and the trajectory of his thought. Of course, it's impossible for me to give a full picture of Professor Dabashi's trajectory in just a few minutes. And the added challenge too is that, as I've jokingly said to him before, Professor Dabashi writes books faster than I can read them. But as someone who's been following his work with great interest for over a decade, I tentatively suggest that there are 2 or 3 distinct tracks in Professor Dabashi's work, among several other tracks in his very richly multifaceted body of work, that are of interest to this conversation probably. One track is in his works over the last 3 or 4 decades, Professor Dabashi has been arguing about the discursive limitations and exhaustion of political Islam or Islamic ideology in the 21st century. From some of his earliest works, including Theology of Discontent, Dabashi has been arguing that political Islam or Islamic ideology as a social and intellectual phenomenon has been, it was born out of this encounter with colonial modernity in Islamic context, and it served an important role in opposition to colonialism and imperialism. But by the time we get to the late 20th century and early 21st century, Professor Dabashi argues political Islam, and especially after the coming to power of Islamists in post-revolutionary Iran, Professor Dabashi has been arguing that political Islam and Islamic ideology has not only exhausted its progressive capacity and historical usefulness, it's also suffocating the cosmopolitan worldliness of Islam and of Muslim societies. And here I'd refer to books like Theology of Discontent and Shi'ism, A Religion of Protest, but also to an essay by Professor Dabashi titled The End of Islamic Ideology, which was published in the year 2000 in the Journal of Social Research. A second track in Dabashi's work, a parallel track, is his effort to recall and revive this cosmopolitan worldliness of Islam, which he argues is now being suffocated by Islamism. We see this in several books, including his 2008 book, Islamic Liberation Theology, Resisting the Empire, in his 2012 book, Being a Muslim in the World. And then there's a third track in Professor Dabashi's work for the last 3 or 4 decades, and that's his engagement with Iran and the Middle East outside of the framework of Islam. His effort to recall and revive a cosmopolitan worldliness that includes Islam, but is not limited to Islam. And here I'm referring to Professor Dabashi's works on art, on literary and cinematic humanism, his 2001 book, Close Up Iranian Cinema, his 2006 book on Palestinian cinema, his 2012 book, The World of Persian Literary Humanism, his 2020 book on travelogues, Reversing the Colonial Gaze, and many others. What I want to suggest is that in Professor Dabashi's new book on Ala Ahmad, these distinct and parallel tracks of his work meet in a very intentional and intimate way. In Ala Ahmad, Dabashi finds both the progressive capacities of a worldly Islam, what Dabashi calls the beginning of a post-Islamist liberation theology, combined with a curiosity about the world, a cosmopolitan disposition, which is all mediated and negotiated through anti-colonial nationalism, third world socialism, and literary humanism. In short, I think in Ala Ahmad's figure, Dabashi finds the intersection of his own various interests and preoccupations, and this is probably why, as he already mentioned in his opening remarks, this book has a deeply autobiographical quality to it. It's not just a book about Ala Ahmad, this is also very much a book about Dabashi himself and his own intellectual trajectory. There is, of course, so much more to be said about the book, but in the interest of time, I will end my comments here and I'll turn to my first question for Professor Dabashi, which is, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, the first time that you wrote about Ala Ahmad, or at least that I'm aware of, was nearly 30 years ago in your Theology of Discontent, which opens with a chapter on Ala Ahmad titled Ala Ahmad and the Dawn of Islamic Ideology. Now you're returning to Ala Ahmad, or as you put it in the book, you are rereading Ala Ahmad on the model of Walter Kaufmann's rereading of Nietzsche. Can you discuss how your own reading of Ala Ahmad has changed over the last 30 years?
Let me think. First of all, let me acknowledge, thank you for this very comprehensive reading. As you said, my reading of I have been blessed to have had the chance and the opportunity to produce a multifaceted body of work. And over the last decade or so, I have started, every time I write a new book, I sort of bring these strands together so people who are following me, like you closely, have a clue as to where things stand. And there are a number of people around the world that have started doing precisely what you just did, namely pulling all of these strings together in a way that makes sense. Also, the important thing is the new generation of scholars, your own generation. Ajay Chowdhury, I'm very happy and grateful that you mentioned Ajay Singh Chowdhury, who wrote an absolutely spectacular doctoral dissertation with me on comparison of Walter Benjamin and Jalal al-Ahmad, whose work I acknowledge and cite because his insight on the relationship between Benjamin and al-Ahmad are very important pioneering work that he did. The thing is that between the Iranian Revolution of 1977-79 and now, 40 years later, much has happened. And people like al-Ahmad are so multifaceted in terms of their prose, their essays, their travelogues, their relationship with his wife, who was a very eminent novelist of her own right. And especially the travelogues, because this book, as you mentioned, comes soon after my book on 19th century Safarnames, that in which, as you recall, I make a major proposal that these people were not going to Europe. So I oppose the assumption that a book of, say, 500 pages, they only pay attention to 30 pages of it, that they're in Paris or London, and disregard the rest of the book, that they're all over the place. So I'm trying to see if we were to read them cover to cover, what sort of a thing will emerge. So in another way, you can read this new book on Al-Ahmad, beginning with the chapter on the travelogues, which he called them Chahar Qibla, 4 directions of prayers: Jerusalem, Mecca, Soviet Union, and United States. My reading of Al-Ahmad has changed in the sense that now I place them in a different context. In the initial reading was in the context of the preparatory stages, 50 years that led to the revolution that ultimately was confiscated, as I argue. So I was providing a genealogy of multiple ideas that included, philosophers like Tabatabai, that included Quranic hermeneuticians like Talaqani, and people like Al-Ahmad. In other words, all of these critical thinkers were part of a different world that sometimes were opposed to each other. In fact, for example, the reading of Velayat of Mutahari was very different than reading of Velayat by Khomeini. But nevertheless, they come, whether intended or unintended consequences of their work towards the moment of the revolutionary disposition. And then it's important that in the introduction that I wrote, in the second edition of that book, I bring this together, what my purpose is. So that second introduction is crucial. But I wrote that book, as you recall, when I was fresh out of graduate school, didn't have a steady job, and I had a postdoc at Harvard. I was just sitting there and reading and writing and documenting, because I was absolutely convinced I will be the last person who has the patience of sitting down and reading all of these tracts. Maktab-e-Islam from Qom, they had a whole collection of it in Widener Library at Harvard. And after me, people wouldn't have patience and perseverance of sitting and reading all of these things to make sense of them. But now is it different. This is a mature work, mature in the sense that I have aged, and I have thought about these things, and I have gone through the trajectory that you just outlined. Do you follow? So all of those aspects that you just outlined become manifested in this book. And also it pivots. That is, if we were to follow the trajectory that you just outlined, people by the end of the book, they will realize that this book is going somewhere. That the book on Edward Said that just came after it, and this book and my current work that I'm doing, they're moving into a direction, and that direction is already evident. I mean, you have seen it. You have provided a genealogy of where it came from, but it also points to a direction that is going. I have to stop and let you talk more than I talk more.
I think people are here to listen to you mostly, but
you mentioned both Golnar Nikpeh, my brilliant student who wrote a wonderful comparative work between Al-Ahmad and Malcolm X, and Ajay Chowdhury, between Al-Ahmad and Benjamin, and of course your own work that I deeply love. Yeah.
Okay, so the other question I have for you, and we have some questions from the audience, but I want to pose this other question to you, and that's about the idea of Al-Ahmad as a Muslim intellectual, which is an intriguing suggestion because, as you discuss in the book, there's a conventional reading of Al-Ahmad, and we're told that Al-Ahmad was born into a sort of very deeply religious clerical family. Initially, he had religious convictions, but then he left Islam for Marxism and then for existentialism. And then near the end of his life, he has his return to Islam moment. And it's at this point that he wrote Qarb Zadegi, and he went on his Hajj pilgrimage and so on and so forth. But you offer a very different take on the question of Ala Ahmad's Muslimness. And in discussing Ala Ahmad's Hajj travelogue, you write, and I'm going to read this short section from the book. You write that Ala Ahmad's Islamist and anti-Islamist readers have abused his Mecca pilgrimage, framing it as his returning to Islam. He never left Islam to return to it. If a Muslim stops praying or performing other ritual duties, that does not make the person a non-Muslim. She or he seeks and performs her or his Islam elsewhere, differently. Ala Ahmad was and remained a Muslim to the bone of his moral and intellectual imagination. His brief turn to the Tudeh party or his attraction to existentialism were not despite, but through his being a Muslim. His Hajj pilgrimage was through his Marxism and existentialism, not in spite of them. And then somewhere else, also in the book, somewhere you suggest that those who knew Ala Ahmad closely, his close friends, they neither thought of him as religious or irreligious. You suggest that Ala Ahmad was always this worldly and cosmopolitan Muslim. So then my question is about your understanding of Muslimness broadly. What does it mean to be a Muslim? What does it mean to be a Marxist or existentialist Muslim? What does it mean to be an agnostic or atheistic Muslim? Because in your other book, which I really love, Being Muslim in the World, you've mentioned the idea of agnostic Muslims and atheist Muslims. These are notions that personally I found particularly helpful as a young reader of your work and as I was trying to negotiate my own identity. Can you talk a little more about this? Who and what is a Muslim?
Very good question, Siavash. Let me begin. There's a joke that in Beirut, somebody enters the airport and the officer says, "Are you Sunni or a Shia?" And he says, "I'm an atheist." You say, "Okay, Sunni atheist or a Shia atheist?" Once a Muslim, always a Muslim. This idea of, he entered, then he exited, or he became a Marxist or a nationalist, or he followed Kasravi, and then he joined the Tudeh party and this and that. I don't think they are contradictory. The culprit is this flawed idea of secularism, for which we don't have an equivalent in Arabic, Persian, or Urdu or Turkish. We just coin Almaniya in Arabic, or in Persian we don't even have. We just say secular. It's an alien concept. I mean, it is a perfectly legitimate concept within the European context. But as Gilad Najjar, my own colleague here at Columbia, said, secularism is Christianity in disguise. So what does it mean for, you have become secular? We need to rethink, as you know, I don't think everything about Iranian history and culture and civilization is Islamic. We have a vast aspect of pre-Islamic history about us, from Zoroastrianism to Manichaeanism to Mazdakism. There are all sorts of, and then our literary heritage is very multifaceted and impossible to pinpoint it. India, beginning with Pahlavi translation of Panchatantra into Pahlavi, and then from Pahlavi into Arabic, and then from Arabic into Persian and other languages, has had a profound impact on the political culture of the region. So, as you said, also being a Muslim in the world, I've always maintained that Islam is a dialogical proposition, is not a monological project. Islamic philosophy emerges in conversation with Greek philosophy, Islamic theology with Jewish theology, Islamic mysticism with Hinduism, etc., etc. And this Islamism itself developed out of a combatant and contestatory confrontation with European colonialism. So Islam is not a monological, it's a dialogical, it's a multiplicity of dialogical propositions. And by definition, anything that is dialogical, it is impossible for it to remain stationary. It is the result of Islamism, which, as you know, I am severely critical of this so-called Roshan Fikrane Dini, because they have extended into what they believe is a very sophisticated intellectual proposition, but it is not. They're nowhere near the hermeneutic sophistication of Nasr Ahmed Abu Zaid, but they are camouflaging their militant Islamism into anti what they call secular. So in other contexts, you may recall, I call them is interlocution with a dead person, because they think that they believe is stable actually is not stable. So if we accept the proposition that Islam and Muslims and Islamic intellectual heritage, etc., has always been dialogical, then the question is that today, in a world that has had an experience of Islamism of, say, and by Islamism, I mean the last 200 years, since Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Rashid Reza, Muhammad Abdo, and all of that, if that Islamism has epistemically exhausted itself, okay, as always, I have a critical appreciation for a period. This Islamism was very productive, was very engaged, was very worldly present, but like everything else, has exhausted its possibilities, doesn't have anywhere to go. And has resulted in the militant Islamism, the ruling regime in Iran, or the ISIS in Syria, or Taliban's, and so forth. If that indeed is correct, meaning the binary supposition between Islam and the West as a modus operandi of knowledge production has exhausted itself, then where is it going? What is happening to Islam? It is in that context that this book on Al-Ahmad makes sense. Namely, I'm retrieving a moment of dialogical disposition of conversation with literatures, with history, with poetry. I mean, none of the current people who are in Iran in exile and what have you are capable of a single essay like Al-Ahmad's essay on Nima, Piramar Cheshme Ma Bud. It's impossible. None of them is capable of an essay like his essay on Hidayat, or his essay on Seventh Seal of Beryaman. That is, the man is conversant, but in that conversation, he has not metamorphosed into his interlocutor. He remains a Muslim. That is, as a result, when he is in his Hajj pilgrimage, and he has a sexual arousal when he sees a woman, he just puts it out and says it, and he drinks and he smokes, and we know that he had an extramarital affair. All of that are real, are worldly, and he remained who he was. And the importance of that text about Sangi Barguri is the testimonial of a Muslim man who can't come to terms with the fact that he has to take his wife to a male gynecologist, but he has the courage of speaking his backwardness, of that he can't do that. Many people have that feeling, but they don't have the courage of actually articulating it. So it is in all of those complexities and contradictions and moments of effervescence and moments of backwardness that I have tried to say, this is how a real human being in conversation with the world will look like.
Thank you, fantastic. Let me just follow up on that very quickly, because what you're proposing in this book, and also in Islamic liberation theology, and I mean in a whole host of your writings, you're talking about an Islam of the future. And you're also talking about a liberation theology to come. I mean, sometimes you refer to it as a liberation theodicy, and with a focus on the value of alterity, that it needs to, I mean, one of your suggestions that I found intriguing and provocative in Islamic liberation theology was the notion of embracing ultimately Tawheed, embracing shirk, Islam embracing its alterity. And I thought that was a fascinating way to think about it. So in that vein, thinking about the Islam of the future and Islamic liberation theology to come, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me, Ala Ahmad, as a Muslim intellectual, and the way that you're describing it and the way that you're putting it in the book. I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around the idea of Jalal as a liberation theologian. Because, of course, when we think of conventionally, when we think of liberation theology, and I know that you have your own critique of Latin American Catholic liberation theology, which you've discussed in your previous works. But when we think about liberation theology, we're thinking about a theological tradition, engaging with the theological doctrines. I mean, when we're thinking about Black liberation theology, we're thinking of the way that James Cone was rereading the Bible from the experience of the Black experience, or Gutierrez, or many others, right? In what way is Jalal a theologian, a liberation theologian? Yeah.
Good question. It is a difference, I always say, between a Weberian conception of religion and a Durkheimian conception of religion. What you just described, namely a theologian engages in theological issues predicated on previous theologians, is a Weberian conception of religion, namely a religion predicated on principles, doctrines, schools of thoughts, and rituals, etc., that constitutes a theology. But the Durkheimian conception of religion is not that. The Durkheimian conception of religion is, again, as you know, is a notion of what he called conscience collective, is collective consciousness. And because collective consciousness of Muslims is not as stable in the period of globalization, right now, I have no doubt that in Korea, you have Muslim communities, young Muslims, aging Muslims, etc. If you consider, for example, the phenomenon of Muslim feminists, namely Muslim women who have started rethinking their position as both women, aware of their rights and responsibilities, rebellious against the imposition of certain restrictions on their behavior, and but at the same time they're Muslims, that they are not women despite being Muslim, or Muslim despite being women. They're both at the same time. That has given rise to the phenomenon of Muslim feminism. If you take that into consideration, people from Nawal Saadawi to Fatima Mernissi to others, then what has changed is the what I call the public sphere, okay? And I call it public and parapublic sphere, upon which the notion of Muslimhood begins to change. So in other words, I go upstream from theology. I go to Ummah. I go to the how did theology emerge? Theology did not fall from the sky, or the only thing that Muslims believe came from the sky, from heaven, is the Quran, not theology. Theology emerged from the lived experiences of Muslims back in the 2nd century of Islamic history, 3rd century, 4th century. We're in a different century. We're in a different context. And in this context, if we consider the fact that Islamism, Islamic ideology, emerged in the context of a confrontation with European colonialism, not that European colonialism itself has become amorphous and decentered, so is Islam that was creating it. It has become amorphous and decentered. In the moment of being amorphous and decentered, we are back in upstream. We're back in this in the public and parapublic sphere, that the question whether Islam is compatible with democracy has always been a flawed question. The question is that Muslims are capable of democracy. Of course, Muslims are capable of democracy, but what form or shape or theology or sociology or geography or anthropology would that compatibility assume depends on where the Muslims are. Muslims in the United States are one thing, Muslims in Egypt are different things. So if we go back to the original question, if we go to a Weberian conception of religion, you're absolutely right. Who is Ala Ahmad to be considered a theologian? But if we go to a Durkheimian and begin with the collective consciousness of Muslims and its agitations and its transmutations and epistemic ruptures that inevitably happen, then for all I know, you could be a theologian. Namely, it's that you can't be a Canadian to be a theologian. You can't have, no beard and being a theologian. So it is going upstream to the moment of the definition of theology. I mean, again, in your own work, Siavash, you know how traditional clerical establishment opposed Shariati, but nevertheless, Shariati was infinitely more popular and more influential, both in his own time and subsequently, than the whole, school of Fayziyeh or Najaf put together.
Thank you. No, that's very useful. That's very helpful that to think of it as in those terms, the Weberian versus the Durkheimian. Okay, we have, I want to share a question that was sent to me via email yesterday from Hossein Hushmand, who's asking, it's a couple of questions really. He's asking, how do you define an intellectual? What do you understand as an intellectual? And then he's also asking, he says, despite the fact that Shariati and Soroush came after Ala Ahmad, why do you consider him, Ala Ahmad, the last Muslim intellectual? And then the third question that he's asking is, we are approaching an era of post-Islamism, but we've also been living in the post-secular era for decades. What political theory do intellectuals like Ala Ahmad offer for this post-secular and post-Islamist era?
Good question. There are three are very interrelated. Let me begin with the last part. Precisely as this friend has asked, post-Islamism and post-secularity coincide. Because and then my argument is that post-Islamism and post-secularity is pre-Islamism and pre-secularity, namely before the catalytic force of Islamism and secularity begin to enter and decide, are you this or that? In the context that I describe, it is not so much Ala Ahmad himself, but the world that Ala Ahmad lived, and the departure that he, as you know, initially he was supposed to go to seminary in Najaf, and then he abandoned it. It was not him, and behind his father's knowledge and wishes, he attended, public school, and without their approval, he joined the Tudeh party and was fascinated by he had a wandering soul, but he was not unique in his wandering soul. There were many wandering souls. So he is a last Muslim intellectual in the sense that the world that created him allowed for the possibility of a Muslim to do all of these things without contradictions, whereas the world that Soroush now and others like him inhabit prohibits it, because the moment that you say, I am a religious intellectual, you have laid monolithic and tyrannical control over what is religious. You follow? How do you know what is religious? And what is your definition of religion has to do with me. I remember years ago in London, I was talking to one of these friends, and I said, I as a Shia, this and that. He said, oh, you consider yourself a Shia? I said, of course I'm a Shia. What do you think I am? And then he said something which is very, very revealing. He said, no, we welcome you. I said, who is we that welcome me? Who are you to welcome me or not to welcome me? I was born to a Shia mother and a Shia father. My father was not praying and was a devotee of Mossadegh, as I describe in my books, for 3 weeks, and the 4th week he was a devotee of Jamal Abdel Nasser. Nobody died to make you a custodian. These people think that they're custodians of Islam. What's his name? Soroush thinks he is a custodian, that we have to write an application, would you kindly consider us, one thing or another. But nobody died to make them make them custodians of anything. So the task is not to make it ad hominem. The task is retrieve the world. Soroush has been expelled from Islamic Republic, but not Islamic Republic from inside Soroush. I don't want to be ad hominem. It has nothing to do with him. It has to do with the universe of thinking that the terms such as practicing Muslim, are you a practicing Muslim? What the hell that's supposed to mean? Right now, I'm a practicing Muslim. I'm talking about books, ideas, fate of 1.3 billion Muslims around the globe. This is practicing my Islam. And whether or not after this conversation, I go and watch a Marvel movie or pray is nobody's goddamn business. We don't have that kind of Catholicism in Islam. Whereas, oh, he's a practicing Muslim, or she is a practicing, I have no idea what that means. Was Rumi a practicing Muslim? Was Avicenna a practicing Muslim? Was Ibn Arabi a practicing Muslim? You see what I mean? I mean, if you go back in history, Fakhruddin al-Razi, was he a practicing Muslim? What about Sohrawardi? Sohrawardi was killed by one of these practicing Muslims, thrown off from the roof. So we can't have it both ways. You have to have a sort of reconfigure what it means to be a Muslim. And in that, sometimes provocatively, I say to make the point that, are you an atheist Muslim? Stand in line.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question from in the Q&A box from Nuruddin Al-Akbar, who says, Professor Hamid, can you explain more about Ahmad Fardid's influence on Jalal al-Ahmad? Does Jalal al-Ahmad mark the rise of the influence of Heidegger's thought more broadly on Iranian intellectuals? Thank you.
Okay, the best source for this, as Siavashu just mentioned, is Ajay Chowdhury. The assumption of, first of all, the best book on Fardid is Ali Mirsapasi's My Buddies, who has studied Fardid inside out. But apropos the question, the assumption of Al-Ahmad's Heideggerianism is entirely bogus. It is an assumption that Mahmoud Houman told him, oh, what you're saying is like Ernst Cassirer's Ubedilini, crossing the lines. They sat together and translated Ubedilini, but their concepts, again, as Ajay Chowdhury puts it brilliantly in his dissertation, are very different. Al-Ahmad was neither Ernst Jungian nor Heideggerian. And again, as Ajay Chowdhury puts it brilliantly, he's much closer to Walter Benjamin. Now, this doesn't mean that there was no Heideggerianism. Of course, there was Heideggerianism, and Fardid was the best representative of it in that era. But Al-Ahmad's temporary flirtation and the taking of the word Gharbzadegi from Fardid doesn't make him Heideggerian.
Thank you. There is a question from, and we do have a little bit of more time, so if other folks want to address their questions to Professor Dabbashy, please feel free to do so through the Q&A box. There is a question from Hossein Hushmand, but since I've already read one of his questions, let me go to the next question and then I'll come back to Hossein. The next question comes from Amin Sajju, another one of my former teachers and mentors. I'm very glad that you're with us, Professor Sajju. He's asking, dialogical Islam is a sensitively cosmopolitan way of seeing the tradition. But how far can we take this when it comes to situating identity? Professor Dabbashy insists that once a Muslim, always a Muslim. Salman Rushdie, one suspects, would have trouble with this. It would play into the canard that you can't renounce an affiliation, which surely it must be.
The reference to Salman Rushdie, I recently wrote because I ran into Salman Rushdie in a flight, and I said there was once a great novelist named Salman Rushdie that Khomeini put a price on his head, and he did succeed. and the poor man was assassinated. Now there is some guy named Salman Rushdie who's running around. But the point that our colleague is raising is more important than the example, namely to what end this dialogical Islam can work. The key word that he uses is identity. In my both Islamic liberation and theology that Siavash just mentioned, and being a Muslim in the world, I play with identity and alterity. It is not just identity. There is a dialogical juxtaposition between what a Muslim is and what a Muslim is not. And that is a dialogical proposition. It's never resolved. Okay, I borrowed the notion of alterity from Levinas's thinking, that since alterity is always changing, so is identity. And it is not to what end does it go. This is why Salman Rushdie is not a good example. The question is, I mean, as you know, even Salman Rushdie at some point under duress, he said, okay, I'm a Muslim, in order to get people off his back. This dialogical disposition between identity and alterity, if we just insist on identity then because somebody becomes the custodian of that identity. Whereas, you read Masnavi, and Masnavi is a take on the Quran, is a commentary on the Quran. It is the Quran in Persian, as many have said, but it is in Persian. So it has a spin to it, which has to do with the moment in Al-Baqarah when God teaches human beings how to name things, and in that sense, this worldliness, this linguisticality, this sociologicality, political, all of these aspects function as a modus operandi of being a Muslim in the world. The world is a context in which being a Muslim, being an American Muslim, is slightly different than being a Muslim in Saudi Arabia. So identity is fluid, is not something stable, has never been stable. It is dialogical, has never been monological. God forbid if any understanding of identity is monological.
Thank you. Okay, so let me go back to Hussein's second question. Hussein is asking, well, it starts with a comment that your cosmopolitanism does not seem to be pluralistic enough, which is why, contrary to what Fanon says at the end of his letter to Shariati, you say without the necessary and acceptable arguments that religious intellectuals are not in the service of humanity, but lead to consolidation of Islamism. Religious intellectuals, by critically rereading tradition, have sought to provide the appropriate resources and reasons for an overlapping consensus, in Rawls's words, on the ethics of modernity. In other words, a kind of what Charles Taylor could call Islamic modernity. Let me add a sort of a different take to this question and put it to you, Professor Dabbouchi. Do you see any redeemable qualities about Islamic thought in Iran, specifically, since we're talking about Iran, since Ala Ahmad? You call Ala Ahmad the last Muslim intellectual. Has there been, I mean, it's been 50 years since Ala Ahmad's passing. Has there been any redeeming quality to anything that Muslim intellectuals have produced?
Listen, there is redeeming quality to anybody. Malikian, I was just listening to him the other day. I have great admiration for Shabastari's reading of hermeneutics. Of course, there is redeeming quality. My only qualms is with the term Roshan Fikr Dini, because it excludes, it is exclusionary, okay? And it lays a claim on religiosity that no one is in a position to put that claim on religiosity. Not that there is no redeeming fact. If I were to choose who I would read, as I usually do, is Shabastari. I find it profoundly insightful about the pluralism and hermeneutics. Now, whether or not my reading of cosmopolitan worldliness is pluralistic enough, I'm not offering it as a political ideology. I'm offering it as an epistemological proposition. As an epistemological proposition, it is open-ended because it always posits triangulation between the world of the author, world of the reader, and world of the text. And this triangulation enables any possibility of pluralism. I'm not dictating, nobody's in a position to dictate pluralism. And whether is Islamic modernity, Islamic modernism, to me, is simply taking the idea of modernity and modernism on face value without its fluctuation in the European context and said, rushing, okay, now we are modern. It is epistemological fallacy, if not laziness. In my book that you just mentioned, The World of Persian Literary Humanism, I say towards the end, I'm not offering an alternative modernity. I'm offering a theory of alternative to modernity, okay? To me, modernity is colonial modernity. There is no modernity without colonialism, okay? And that's Benjamin, it's not me. Any monument to civilization is a monument to barbarity. You cannot sort of forget the dark underbelly. This is an entire projection of the coloniality in Latin America that you see in Walter Mignolo and others, has to do to bringing the ugly underbelly of modernity and modernism to the fore. But that is not to, and so rushing to say, okay, Islam can have modernities, Chinese can have modernities, is flawed. We need critical thinking as the colonial thinkers, both in Africa, like Mudimbe, and in Latin America, like Walter Mignolo, are doing, or alternative to modernity, not alternative modernities.
Thank you. And I mean, I was also reading this in your book recently, in Ala Ahmad's book, that you're talking about how this is a proposition that, again, you had started making in The World of Persian Literary Humanism, about the crisis of the subject is not our crisis. It's a crisis of European modernity. And I thought the discussion, for those who have read the book or will go on to read the book, the discussion on death of the author versus the birth of the author in discussing Ala Ahmad was really interesting. So now going back to the questions, there's a question from Bomi Min, one of my excellent graduate students who's participating in this seminar, where we're reading your book. And she's asking, on Ala Ahmad's gendered voice, what other examples can you provide, particularly other than the figure of his aunt and the female characters that he mimics excellently? Maybe in his essays, is there any evidence of this gendered voice in his essays? Is he perceptive to matters of gender, or does he automatically embody the female through his relationship with Daneshvar?
Again, excellent question. My point about that chapter that ended up being much longer, and I'm happy it became much longer than it was, begins with an anecdote that Simin Daneshvar shares with us, that she and Ala Ahmad used to walk together, and then they come across somebody or some incident, and then they start writing a story in their mind about that incident, and then sharing their stories together. That this begins as a sort of a binary, a husband and a wife, but they eventually begin to coalesce and come together. This is the reason I say that towards the end of Sangi Barguri, Tombstone, ultimately what he does, he goes to an aunt who was also a childless aunt. And in effect, speaking of other genres, say his short stories, for example, that in his mind, as we have from that intertextual reference in Tombstone, Sang Barguri, it is really his childless storytelling aunt, which is in him telling stories. This, because as you know, in Persian, we don't have a gendered pronoun. Is he, she, doesn't exist. So we have to be able to bring intertextual references in which the voice of the mother, the voice of an aunt, the voice of one's partner, all come into the definition or the voice in which the person writes that makes it gendered. There has to be more detailed studies. When I was writing the chapter on the relationship with Simin Daneshvar, I say somewhere at some footnote, I forget where, that this is a treasure trove of material. I feel guilty that I only have to pay attention to the things that matter to Al Ahmad and abandon the rest, but they have to be read closer. Because also the thing is that in the writing of Savashun, you will see that gendered voice in her as well. So there is a fusion. I talk of anima and animus in that chapter, of the fusion of the gendered voice. Again, by way of correcting something that he has been read, in my opinion, a little bit too violently.
Thank you. We're approaching the end of our time, and there's still a couple of questions. So maybe I'll read both of the questions out, and then you can provide some brief comments on them. One question is coming from another graduate student of mine, an excellent graduate student who's going on to do a PhD at the University of Toronto soon, Kanha Kim, who's asking, is there any hint, any possibility that the state could ever contribute to religion, or the works of people like Ali Shariati could contribute? And I assume he's talking about sort of this rereading and the project of modernization. Are previously emancipatory and dialogical modes of Islam doomed to turn into tyrannical, violent, and rigid ones when it's instituted as the formal one endorsed by the state? Is it not the reproduction of a strict binary between the state and the people? And then the second question is coming from Dr. Zulfikar Rahim, who's asking you, have you read any Ismaili works to formulate your thoughts? If so, which works? What do you think of the cosmopolitanism approach, I assume, in Ismaili tradition?
The problem with two questions is I always forget the first one. About the Ismailis, I read the work of Nasser Khosrow. The work of Nasser Khosrow is definitive to my thinking, not just his poetry and his travelogue, but particularly his philosophical work. And the fact that he could oscillate so easily and fluently from philosophy to poetry to social observations is a key factor. So that's so far as Ismail. Now repeat the first one, Siavash, I forget.
The first one is basically, can the state play any role in defining Islam?
Absolutely. I make absolute binary distinction between a state and nation. Absolute and apologetic. The state to me, is a monopoly of violence. Finish. You could have the greatest humanist on planet Earth joining a state. She becomes an instrument of monopoly of violence. That's Weber. That's not me. That's not Fanon. That's not any critical thing. A state is a monopoly of violence. Any state anywhere. Okay, total state. I call them recently in a recent essay, total state and naked violence, and all the camouflaging and so forth. In my recent book, The Emperor is Naked, is the fact that the idea of the nation state was a colonial monkey wrench that was thrown at the fragments of three last Muslim empires that has nothing to do with us. And as a result, in my recent work, I talk about the sovereignty of the nation, not sovereignty of the state. Sovereignty is the monopoly of the nation that can give or withdraw from the state. But today, in the current condition, whether we are in Canada and have Trudeau or we are in any other context, a state is monopoly of violence, period.
Thank you. And I mean, that seems also consistent because Kanha's question also made a reference to Shariati. That seems consistent with Shariati's distinction between movement versus institution, Islam as a movement, as a nehzat versus as an institution, as a nizam. Okay, we have reached the end of our time. I want to thank once again Professor Hamid Dabbashy for making the time to join us for this conversation about his new book. I recommend that all of you read the new book, especially since it's going to be available in open access. I also want to thank our dear friend Ehsan Kashfi for his help with this. He's been up since 4 a.m. He's in Iran, and he's been up very early to help us set up this event and helping on the technical side of things. And I want to thank all of you for joining us from wherever you've joined us in Korea, in North America, and elsewhere around the world. Have a good day, have a good night, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you, Professor Dabbashy. Once again, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for hosting this. Give my warmest to Mujtaba and thank all the members of the audience, friends and colleagues who kindly joined us. I'm grateful for their questions and comments.
Thank you. Okay. خدا نگهدار.
خدا نگهدار. شب بخیر. صبح بخیر.